It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's episode 72 of our amalgamated program where we look at matters political in Australia and then move around the world and have a good look around there. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate.
G'day.
How you going? How are things in Hong Kong today?
Oh, we haven't got a public holiday. It's terrible.
No, a week without one. Surely not. Oh, you did enjoy a day off last week, if we can call it that.
And it was May Day, so that's a holiday on the mainland as well. And I think we got up to 180,000 mainland visitors per day, which is it used to be about 200,000.
On a public holiday or just any given day?
Over the 3 days of the May Day holiday on the mainland.
Right.
And so that was good to see. Lots of tourists lining up, walking around in groups behind blokes carrying a little flag.
I'm having lunch with a Hong Konger, an expat, indeed, on Friday, and I'll hear what he has to say. I think his plan is to set up in Bangkok. Runs a business in Hong Kong, but I think he's sort of trying to move it holus bolus to Bangkok. We'll find out a little bit more about that lunch on Friday.
There's a little bit about that. People claim that's to do with the national security law, etc. But when they move to Singapore, I think that makes them look rather foolish because the national security architecture in Singapore is much more harsh than Hong Kong.
Yeah.
But there is a reason for people moving to places like Bangkok, Dubai, or various spots in other spots in Thailand. And that's cost. They are much cheaper to operate in.
Yes, of course. We've been over the high cost of real estate, renting and buying, of course, in Hong Kong. And look,
that's the only thing that's expensive here, really. I've got a couple of friends from Hong Kong who are down in Australia, and they are horrified. Not at the price of a decent dinner and a good bottle of wine. That's much the same as Hong Kong. But they are horrified when they go and have 4 beers or go and have 2 sandwiches and 2 coffees. That's much, much, much more expensive.
Oh, yeah. There's no doubt about that. The sort of cafe culture in Australia more broadly, very, very expensive. Even the fast food guys, I don't find to be terribly cheap, you know. Family dinner of McDonald's would cost you the best part of 50 cents. So, things are certainly not cheap around that for Australia, and I don't know how a lot of these cafes may not exist in the years to come. I think when we're sort of getting into an $8 coffee, we're starting to lose the plot a little bit. But we better move on to other matters. Now, Bob Carr is in a bit of a stink with the New Zealand Deputy Prime Minister. Is he Foreign Minister as well, Winston Peters, Jack?
I believe he is, yeah.
He is, yes. That's probably the right title for him because Peters has called Bob Carr basically a puppet of the Chinese government, and Carr has responded by saying, I'm going to sue you, and the writ's in the mail apparently. Both of them are fairly odd characters, Jack, I'd have to say.
Well, a blue between the pair of them would be a good thing to watch because they're both hardened political veterans from a culture of sort of pretty head-kicking political approach.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. What he said, calling Carr a puppet of the Chinese government, is that in itself defamatory? I wouldn't imagine it is. And and it might be perceived as such, but is this the sort of court case you'd want to have?
No.
Where they go and present evidence of truth, associations with the Chinese Communist Party, etc. Bob Carr's not in public life anymore, but I'm not sure that'd do him any good.
I don't think there's any upside for Bob Carr in suing Winston Peters.
There was something else that was very interesting about Carr, and that is some revelations, perhaps might be a strong word, but he actually was providing a bit of information to the US Embassy around the time of the Whitlam government, Jack, when he was just a kid. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, I believe he and John Ducker, John Ducker was he was the hard man of the New South Wales right, the faction that Bob Carr grew up in.
So what sort of information were they providing to the US Embassy?
There are files available in the US that indicates that nothing terribly dramatic. They were offering a critique of the Whitlam government, of the good and bad bits of it, and there was plenty of both. And I think it's relatively unremarkable that they were doing so.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. The once confidential cables also suggest that US diplomats turned to Mr. Carr, who would have been about 25, as a source of background information on Labor political figures. For example, Mr. Carr explained that a speaker at a pro-Palestinian demonstration in 1975 left-wing Labor parliamentarian George Peterson was a New South Wales equivalent of Victoria's Bill Hartley. The Americans would be scratching their heads at this, Jack.
You would hope that someone in the American embassy would know who Baghdad Bill was, Bill Hartley. But this is. I would hope that our embassy officials, our people in Washington, et cetera, are out there making the same sort of contacts and talking to people and getting some background. If they're not, we're wasting our money.
Yeah, look, I understand that. The story goes, it was actually highlighted in a film called The Falcon and the Snowman, around a story of espionage, where a low-level data analyst had basically stolen secrets US secrets, and had attempted to sell them to the Russian embassy in Mexico. And not with very much luck, but he was becoming very concerned about the CIA's activities. That's why he did what he did. He ended up doing basically a life sentence in jail. He was caught. But one of the things that upset him most of all was CIA interference in Australian politics, Jack.
I kind of expect that there will be that sort of degree of interference.
Well, what sort of degree of interference would be acceptable to you?
Well, there's only one rule in international espionage: is what you can get away with.
Yeah, but what we do know about 1975 is you got a government gets rolled, and at the same time they're being undermined by the CIA in the United States. I mean, they're our allies.
I don't know that there's anything convincing that they were undermining the Whitlam government. The Whitlam government was quite capable of undermining itself.
Yeah, true enough, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't interference, Jack. That doesn't mean that our allies weren't attempting to unseat a popularly elected government, Jack.
I've never seen anything convincing that suggests that anything...
You want me to take you to Chile?
Anything that...
You want me to take you to Argentina?
No, I'm talking about Australia.
You want me to take you to El Salvador?
Yeah, of course they do this. I'm talking about Australia in 1975, which is what you raised, and I've never seen anything convincing that suggests the CIA had any impact on what happened in 1975.
Perhaps you should have a look at The Falcon and the Snowman. It's a very good film. And no one's ever doubted what he did. I mean, basically he was motivated by the fact that his father was a CIA operative as well, and he became very disillusioned with what the CIA was up to, including with its allies. Meanwhile, student debt, $3 billion has been wiped off the map for of HECS debts. Graduates with an average debt of $26,500 will have $1,200 wiped from outstanding student loans. And recent university graduates with debts averaging some $45,000 will have $2,000 wiped from their outstanding loans. Can I ask why this is all happening, Jack?
Probably for political reasons, I would think.
Yeah, but why now? Why are we doing this now?
Why for political reasons now? Because the government's got a problem with an uncomfortable relationship with the student population.
Right. So we're wiping off $2,000 tests. One thing that really caught my eye just in recent times is that there was a heavy disincentive in terms of HECS debt for students to undertake arts degrees, but it's just been ignored by students. They're just moving on to do arts degrees. There were, the government, the previous government, this Morrison government initiative, they were trying to drag them into nursing, engineering, these sorts of things, and reducing HECS debt over it. And the numbers of enrolments in arts-based degrees around the universities around Australia have never been higher.
Mm.
Interesting, isn't it? That you've actually got a detailed disincentive not to do it, and people do it anyway.
Yeah, that's why it's important not to completely remove the price signal attached to these things. The United States has done that. And the result has been that. So if you make, I think, 1980 as a base figure, the inflation in the United States has been 220-odd%, and the rate and the increase in college fees has been 1,200%, and that's because the federal government is in fact underwriting all the student debt. So there is no price signal at all. People aren't discouraged from doing a degree that won't earn them any money because they figure the US federal government will in the end carry the can for it.
Well, back in the old days at La Trobe University, and the toilet just under the library there, you'd go in there for an ablution, and there it was, the toilet roll, and just above it, someone had written, "Arts degree, please take one." There's a lot to be said for arts degrees. You don't denigrate them. Lot to be said for studying history, a lot to be said for studying literature, a lot to be said for studying politics. But at the end of the day, people have to get some work out of it. But they will find that they've got a little bit reduced. I don't believe this was ever government policy during the campaign anyway. So look, I understand the politics around it. I'm not naive, but I'm just wondering why now. And maybe it's a pre-budget sort of allocation.
And I think they've got a particular problem when there are student protests quite often at the moment, and they feel like they are being attacked from the left by the Greens in a way that will attract students and recent students to vote Green, not Labor. And it's a political attempt to adjust that.
Opposition education spokeswoman Sarah Henderson described the reform, it's a reform rather than some sort of money back. But the federal government, it must be said, will use next week's budget to cap the indexation rate. So it'll be on HECS debt. So it'll be calculated as the lower of the consumer price index, 7.1 this year, or the wage price index, which is 3.2%. So it's a formula for reducing the HECS debt. But opposition education spokeswoman Sarah Henderson described the reform as a band-aid to a bullet wound. Under Labor, student debts will still increase by a crippling 11.1% over 3 years, driving up the average loan by $2,800, she said. Can we just talk about Sarah Henderson, Jack? It would be hard to find a worse politician in the country. She got the flick from the reps. She got the flick for the people of Geelong and more broadly around the Bellarine Peninsula. and then she just walked straight into a Senate spot. I mean, how did that happen? It just tells you how weak the Liberal Party is.
Presumably she can count.
Well, if ex-husband was a apparatchik, Liberal Party apparatchik, it's staggering to me that someone who has been just hurled from power, the often marginal seat of Corangamite, thrown out, made to look a bit of a fool in the process. I mean, her campaigning was very, very odd. And then almost within a dropkick of the election result, a Senate vacancy pops up and in she goes. I mean, you're never gonna get new talent if you continue to do these things.
No, this is a common mistake from political parties, which is why we had a Senator Christina Kennelly.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, and the people get it. I mean, but if you hide away in the Senate, you won't be punished for this. I mean, you'll be punished elsewhere. I mean, like Labor ended up losing the seat that she ran in and should have won, or, well, let's say Drover's dog would have won.
Good. This is Christina Kennelly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And
she was able to get a Senate spot because she could count. In the same way that Senator Henderson got a Senate spot.
Look, I get the bit about counting, but really it's about loyalty and displaced loyalty in many cases.
But it's not good for the political parties who do this.
No, it's not.
Generally speaking, it's not.
No, and look, it's the same goes for parachuting factional leaders into Labor safe seats where they've got no background. I mean, we saw the old seat of Batman. I always forget what they call it now.
McNamara?
No, it's not McNamara. That's over. That's over on the Bayside. But yes, I'll look it up in a minute. But what used to be, in fact, when it was Batman. They really just use it as a factional plaything. They were dropping people in from New South Wales.
You're talking about
Martin Ferguson.
Martin Ferguson.
He'd need a map to find Northcote, mate.
Yeah. It's now called Cooper, by the way.
Cooper, that's right. Yeah, I'm just trying not to always forget. It'll always be Batman for us, probably, but
that's because we have a particular connection to it.
Yes, of course. The man who did the deal for the purchase of land was named after the seat, and did you know, Jack? He wanted to call Melbourne Batmania, and that was even before the Batman. Obviously, before the Batman comic series came out, and probably in the 30s. Wanted to call it Batmania, and he was, a pretty horrible person. Syphilitic, running around, wiping out Tasmanian Indigenous folk and all sorts of things. But his name stuck with the electorate for a long, long time. Now it's called Cooper. Now it's back to some sort of order in terms of who the local member is. But for a long time there, it was just a gift to be given to factional warlords.
Who came after Martin Ferguson?
Bloke I'm trying to think of his name. He couldn't remember how many houses he had.
David Fernie. Before Martin Ferguson was Brian Howe, who was at least a local.
Yeah, he was, yeah.
And before Brian Howe was Horry Garrick, who a dear friend of ours worked for.
Yes.
Was his chief of staff.
And Horry was a former mayor of Collingwood. Again, you'd say, yeah, look, there's nothing wrong with that. But Marn Ferguson, who basically Sydney-based, and then Feeney, who couldn't remember how many houses he had, and all of a sudden you had probably one of the safest Labor seats in the country, taken by the Greens. I mean, it's a Labor seat now, but that's what you do when you treat voters with contempt.
Yeah.
All right, we've been talking a lot about asylum seekers and the Administrative Affairs Tribunal. Enormous backlog, Jack, around people seeking protection orders, around people wanting to stay in the country for a host of reasons, not just on the basis of asylum. And there's an enormous backlog. Let me know how bad it is.
40,000 at the moment.
Asylum backlog at the AAT. So that is, there will perhaps...
Well, in short terms, these are people who have applied to the government for a protection visa and been rejected, and they are exercising their right to appeal that decision at the AAT. So there's 40,000 outstanding cases.
42,000 separate. This will require a hearing, more or less. I think we can say that will require 41,855 hearings, Jack.
That they would need to be offered a hearing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it may not necessarily go that far.
No, because a lot of these are what they cleverly call a non-meritorious applications. They are merely applications to extend the stay in Australia. I spent 10 years serving on the AAT's predecessor, and in all that time, I never got above 50% of people who would actually turn up.
Meritorious, Jack. If you're not meritorious, what does that mean?
It's a clever way of saying that the application is a bit of a nonsense, really.
Right.
My view at the time was that if you really fear that you're going to be persecuted and you are offered a hearing to explain why and how you are going to be persecuted, and you don't bother to turn up, then your fear of persecution is not really very genuine.
Right. Right. We'll move straight on.
And they could deal with that backlog a lot more quickly if they just said, if you don't turn up, the thing's dismissed.
Well, we'll deal with it sort of an issue conflated by it, and this is the story in Perth of a fellow by the name of Majid Jamshidi Dukoshan. And he had basically been released by order of the High Court last year. He's been allegedly involved in an awful home invasion where an elderly lady was bashed senseless. And it turns out he did have the ankle bracelet, but the battery ran out. And it seems also there just doesn't seem to be any attempt around bail. This guy was bailed before that, before the event and his alleged involvement in it. But he was bailed on serious offences earlier, Jack. What's going on there?
Yeah, it looks a bit of a shambles, doesn't it?
Well, what are magistrates doing these days? I mean, different context, I know, but I look at the ACT Magistrates Court and see some people there. There was one fellow who's part of the sort of freedom movement. He pushed a woman over and she put her hands up and to protect herself and fractured both wrists. So it's a pretty terrible injury. He took off, so he wasn't arrested at the scene. They finally caught up with him in New South Wales. The coppers grabbed him. They brought him in and charged him in New South Wales. On video link, he was bailed on his own reconnaissance. Didn't turn up to the first trial, so the New South Wales cops had to go and grab him again. Given bail again by the ACT magistrate. And then we went through it all again. He didn't turn up. New South Wales cops had to go and arrest him, and finally he was brought to the ACT. Guess what happened when he got to the magistrates' court, Jack? He was given bail again.
Can I just say, in fairness to the Western Australian magistrate in this case, the prosecution did not oppose bail.
There's your problem right there.
So this is the prosecutor. So ultimately, Your Honour, the prosecution does have concerns about his ability to not commit further offences.
I saw this, yeah.
Particularly in relation to the curfew, having regard to his attitude towards compliance thus far. Notwithstanding that, Your Honour, we do not oppose bail with a personal undertaking, warning, warning, warning. But that's a mistake.
Absolutely a mistake.
The government, meanwhile, has been trying to hide behind this new body that they've formed called the Community Protection Board and say that these are decisions about curfews and ankle bracelets are made by the Community Protection Board. But that's not entirely correct. The Community Protection Board makes recommendations to a delegate of the minister. So when the ministers don't personally see all the paperwork for ministerial decisions, they delegate that authority to someone within their department. Right? That's how protection visas work. You apply to the minister for a protection visa, but he doesn't see the paperwork. It goes to a delegate of the minister.
Right. But
so this Community Protection Board is advising the delegate, but of course the delegate makes the decision, not the Community Protection Board. So this is a bit of political trickery in my view, which is just making Andrew Giles in particular, but he and Claire O'Neill look sillier by the day. The government
Giles is looking very, very silly and has been for some months.
Yeah, when you said earlier on that Sanderson Henderson is the worst politician in Australia, I thought, well, Andrew Giles is
he's up there. Yeah, he's definitely on the podium. For a factional boss, I've never seen anyone perform so poorly. And a guy with he's a lawyer and came from a good school. All this sort of, I've never seen anyone speak so poorly, Jack, and have such a poor grasp of what they're doing. It's like he's not across his brief,
and he never looks like he. And what you mean is he never looks like he knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly right. Mm. So what we have now is that this group of people, I forget how many that were released in total, have been released in total. And now they are sort of answerable to a board, provided that they don't commit offences in the meantime. Is that right? Answerable to a board in terms of their movements, in terms of
they're not actually answerable.
Or restrictions are placed upon them.
No, the board makes a recommendation to the delegate as to what sort of restrictions they're going to have. So.
I think most Australians look at someone like Bukashkan and say, "Why don't we just throw him out of the country?"
Yeah, that's not possible.
Why?
Because there are rules and laws and got to be complied with.
So we can't get rid of him. He's a menace to the community. So he's basically got to be locked up.
Well,
but not before he's committed.
Can I just add, I don't know enough about the particular circumstances of his case to know whether he can or can't be deported. But very often these people can't be deported. And that's the whole basis of this controversy really is how much is the Australian government allowed to demand cooperation from these people in order to get them deported?
Yeah, Dukashkan. So I gather we're talking one of the former Soviet republics, Jack. But I don't know.
Yeah, I can't recall.
Yeah, but there must be something keeping him in the country. But as I say, most Australians will just go, look, just put him on a burner, and if he doesn't want to go back, we'll just dump him at Singapore airport.
Yeah.
I understand it doesn't work that way, but that's the way a lot of Australians will feel about it.
The Singaporeans might object.
well, the bloke who lived in Paris Airport for about 30
Charles de Gaulle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, he was rendered stateless. That was the problem there.
That was a different situation, but
yeah. And if you're going to be stuck in an airport somewhere, Changi's rather delightful.
Oh, Changi would be nice. You have a nice sleep there. As long as you've got a bit of dough coming in. Very nice. Dubai, Singapore, two of the best airports in the world. You could probably go to either one of them, cause a bit of mayhem there, and it's not going to end well for him. But it can't happen. And this is the difficulty, and this is the failure really of Giles and his more senior minister, the Home Affairs Minister, to actually explain what's going on with people and say, look, this is the issue that we've got, and explain it better than just in the Parliament. I mean, Giles would be flat out doing that, but people just don't understand why are these people here. Why are these people here? And then they go and commit crimes, serious crimes, brutal crimes, and we've still got to tolerate them.
Yeah, well, we are stuck with people because there are rules about the deportation of people, and this has been an attempt to change those rules to say if you don't cooperate in your own deportation, then there's going to be a consequence. That's going to be 12 months jail. But the government has utterly failed to explain all this.
They have, yeah.
And
that's
and
part of the problem.
I personally think they're bleeding politically on account of it.
I think there are really big issues around the country, Jack, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney around immigration numbers generally. We've got high numbers, and we've also got significant stresses in housing, rental crisis and what have you. And there is a fair amount of heat around immigration. And
this bleeds into that heat around immigration.
It does, yeah. It's part of the whole package. Look, there are lots of reasons why Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, as his predecessor, lost the 2010 election. Sorry, 2013 election. And I've got that right, haven't I? So it was 2007, 2010 was the minority. Yeah, 2013, and got walloped by Tony Abbott. Well, if you get beaten by Tony Abbott, you've obviously got things very badly wrong. But one of the strong perceptions was around boat arrivals is that the government had lost control of immigration policy. Yeah, and that is one big thing that will get you kicked out of government.
Because it's for a lot of people, this is kind of a rule of law, not law and order, but an orderly rule of law issue, not anything else.
Yeah, it's not a xenophobic thing. It's really not xenophobic. It's just like we've lost control of our borders.
Yes, yeah. And at the moment, that means you've got to be able to get out there and sell a message. You've got to be able to get out there and explain to people what's going on and why. Yeah. And it's time for the Prime Minister to step in and say...
people know, for example, that the very high rates of immigration we've had, driven by the pandemic, where we had virtually none.
No.
And now we've got people coming in on temporary visas, able to work, students, those sorts of things, people coming in performing work that, let's face it, Australians don't want to do, whether it's picking fruit or slaughtering cattle and sheep, those sorts of things. People are coming in and filling. But do people understand that this is tapering off?
Some parts of it are tapering off. The asylum seeker thing's getting worse.
Well, that's obviously getting worse, but that's not something. To be fair, that's not something they can control. When we're talking about immigration numbers in total, you have to look for these things rather than have a government explain them to the public, and that's Giles' fault. I mean, Albanese and other senior members of the government must be looking at him and going, gee, we'd love to get rid of him.
Well, I think it's past time for the Prime Minister to say we need someone smart in there. Maybe Claire O'Neill gets to hold her job but Giles has got to go.
Oh, Claire O'Neill, I think, is a different kettle of fish, but Andrew Giles seems completely gormless.
Well, she's the senior minister. She can't wipe her hands from this entirely. But maybe she survives, but he's got to go.
Oh, he's definitely got to go. Definitely got to go. And the word from Canberra is nice bloke. No ability as a politician. I mean, and I don't mean that as being into rhetoric and having lots of debating jousts and all that sort of stuff. I mean, just in terms of the hard public policy, that's where he seems to completely be at sea. All right, Higgins and Reynolds, Jack, it goes on.
The gift that keeps giving.
It just goes on and on and on. I read this morning that former Minister Linda Reynolds is seeking to crack open a trust established by Brittany Higgins when she received a $2.4 million compensation.
She is. She's arguing that that trust was formed to prevent those funds being at risk in any future litigation.
How's that going to go, Jack? She's got to win first.
Don't know. Don't know how the application to disband the trust will go. And I think her defamation claim against Higgins is not bad. Against Shiraz is very good. But I don't know that it's going to get her a large chunk of money either.
And Fiona Brown's been named on this show a number of times as probably the person who comes out of all of this mess looking the best. She has no action at in regard to anything. She sensibly stayed away from the lawyers, possibly, but I think there's an enormous amount of fatigue around this topic now, and there's plenty more to go. I believe 4 ACT police officers are suing the ACT public prosecutor.
As is Drumgold, I think the prosecutor.
And then there's another inquiry. You go too far. You go too hard. The media goes too hard too often, and where it leaves people is just fatigue. Now, that's not to say these matters won't be dealt with properly in the courts, but it would seem that Linda Reynolds is playing pretty hard ball, and Brittany Higgins wants to move on. And given the Justice Lee's findings, she's still a person that attracts a significant amount of sympathy for good reason, it must be said.
Yeah, the
I don't know how this all ends. It just seems now it's just seamy. I mean, it was always a bit ugly, but now it's just kind of seedy and awful.
The judge in Western Australia has done everything possible to encourage the resolution of those proceedings without success so far. The person who does need to go and see a lawyer is Fiona Brown. They should be cobbling together an application for an ex gratia payment.
Maybe she's just got a bit too much class to do it, Jack. She probably would be in the frame there, but. I just wanted to talk to you just a little bit off the bat here about what actually occurred in the government school in Perth, Jack. And here we have a young boy who became a Muslim, I think in his teens, who'd been shot dead by police after wandering the school with a great big kitchen knife and threatening people and causing some injuries. And what we've seen with all forms of terrorism is just how quickly people who are, let's say, vulnerable, for want of a better term, how quickly they get radicalised. And it's absolutely stunning. So if we go back to the sorts of people like Mohammed Atta and the 9/11 crew, Al-Qaeda took 2 to 3 years of, I guess, brainwashing to get them to that point. Now we're seeing with some of the terrorism in Europe and this particular event involving a minor, and they're being radicalised sometimes within days and less, just being radicalised online. There are no hate preachers in Perth. Indeed, a number of members of the Islamic community sought to assist this fellow to try and de-radicalise him, but obviously to no great effect. And that's another thing. I think people think that you can deprogram people who have adopted extremist views, and that'll all be well. Most of the research I've read about deprogramming says it doesn't work. But yeah, what were your thoughts when you heard that, Jack? It's incredibly sad. You've got very young people being being dragged into very, very evil business, and being radicalised online by Islamic State, these sorts of crews. There's also, there's other elements. It's not just Islamic terrorism that we have to worry about here. When we talk about some people from the extreme right, some of their followers just get radicalised very, very quickly too.
Well, teenagers are the most suggestible people in the world, Western teenagers in particular.
And then you've got people with perhaps not well-developed brains or minds when they're in their 20s. And like I say, the impact of looking at material online, being directed towards material online, is that they get radicalised very, very quickly and start planning things that, planning terrorist events, mass killings and what have you,
Well,
all in the space of a couple of days.
I think it's the combination of having a very suggestible group of people, that is young people, teenagers and young adults, and the influence of online media, the easy accessibility to go down a rabbit hole, if you like, on online media. You can do that very quickly. You haven't got to go to the catalogue desk in the library and find one book and then go and find the next book. You can do it in a matter of hours.
Yeah, and when you look at the other side of it, when we talk about deprogramming or de-radicalising people, it's almost impossible to do. It's certainly impossible to do if that individual does not want to contribute, does not want to participate.
Yeah.
So big problems. And there are big problems coming too, Jack, because it's right about this time. We've got Goldman Supermax, where most of the terrorists convicted in Australia now live, and some of them are coming out. Some of them, over the next 3 to 4 years, they're coming out. Most of them have resisted deprogramming. You would have seen Ben Bricker was released from custody not so long back. Says he's a changed man. He's the sort of hate preacher who'd sort of convinced.
The chap from Melbourne.
Yeah, from Melbourne, who convinced others to attack the MCG and other places. I think Anzac Day was another one. These guys are all coming back to the community, Jack. So there are provisions for having them continually monitored, but it is a big problem that we have.
Yes.
You've got some very willing people about to be released on the streets. They've served their sentences. They haven't got any time off for good behaviour. They're just going to come out.
It ought to be said that our problem with this kind of thing in Australia is much less than somewhere like France or Germany or the UK or even the US.
Well, the French prison system has probably sorted them out, Jack. They reckon it's the worst in Europe, certainly in Western Europe. Maybe that helps a bit. But, yeah, look, you would imagine that these problems are far more serious in the UK, in Belgium, France, as you say, and elsewhere. But we do have, because we had a rush of convictions, or a rash of convictions, shall we say, that about 12 to 14 years ago, these guys are all sort of starting to come out.
Indeed.
It's not great. Unions in Queensland, Jack, are they scanning the horizon and thinking we may not have access to power for very much longer? Because they're getting involved in a bit of brawling, aren't they?
Well, this is not uncommon in the history of trade union officials in Australia.
No brawling.
A little bit of toe to toe. This is a very nice May Day dinner they have each year for the union movement in Brisbane. And the reporting is that the Electrical Trade Union State Secretary and his counterpart at the Maritime Union of Australia, the Wharfies, as I used to know them, had a bit of a disagreement on their way into the meeting, and it descended into, well, a couple of cut lunches might have been thrown, I think.
A little bit of, not fisticuffs, but close to, a little bit of argy-bargy, Jack.
But this is this. I think you've put the nail on the head here. This is to do with their expectation that there will be a change of government, which generally leads to a realignment of political influence and factional infighting. Whilst the government stays in place, everyone stays in their position. But when the government's gone, everyone's jockeying for the new power paradigm and trying to get their hands on the levers of power for themselves.
Well, the CFMEU, and I think it's CFMMEU, but they might have just turned that so it's mining and maritime. CFMMEU and his State Secretary Michael Rafah came out swinging, I should say, this week, not only against Cross River Rail contractor CBB, but also the AWU, which Rafah dubbed Australia's worst union. He really thought that went through.
Back in the early 1980s, when I was first putting on the suit and tie and going to work as a lawyer, we were acting for what was then called the Builders Labourers Federation. You remember those, the BLF in Victoria?
BLF, yeah.
And we spent more time fighting. We spent more time fighting the AWU than anybody else. And they in turn spent a lot of time fighting us. And this is what this dispute is about. It's about who gets coverage of the workers on particular projects.
Yes. Rafah went on, though, Jack. He accused the AWU of corruption, cooking its books and being a creche for political hacks and a blight on the trade union movement. That's better. That's a nice old slapping. And this was after the court fined the union $290,000 for 27,140 contraventions. That's the CFMEU, by the way, isn't it? Not the AWU.
Yeah.
And they were back on strike last week around a major construction site in Brisbane. So there you go. Trouble in paradise. There, you would say. It looks all over for the Labor government in Queensland and the Miles government there.
At least he'll get to say he got to be premier, even if it was only for a little while.
Well, I did see some polling analysis that sort of pointed to the fact that Labor's it's polling, not always, but often it's polling while in government. And let's face facts, since the Borbidge government, I think Queensland. I think Labor's been in government in Queensland for all but 3 years.
Just the Newman interregnum.
That's it. Yeah. So there's three, and we're talking about 35 years. So significant period in power. But this polling analyst was pointing out that Labor often didn't poll well in the lead up to elections, 6 months out in the past, because they have been in power for such a long time. We'll see. It doesn't look all that great for Stephen Miles, but it might be one of those things where they can pick up enough votes to survive during the campaign. It'll have to be a hell of a good campaign, and of course they will be throwing some money around the place. Moving on, the role for gas in energy and the future for electricity. Can I just start this by saying we can have gas if they tear up the contracts that John Howard signed with them all, that basically said, yeah, you can have our gas and you can export it and we'll get the pittance. We'll get the pittance at whatever's left over. Absolutely outrageous negotiations from a Prime Minister of this country, and I don't know why no one pulls him up on it. He certainly spends enough time in public life for people to say, "Hey, what about these contractual arrangements the nation made, the Commonwealth made with gas mining companies for you to
export the gas
to export at a price cheaper than we can buy it here."
Cheaper than
someone should flog that old man for that alone.
Cheaper than we can buy it for domestic consumption.
I know. It's insane. I mean, we're constantly told, that Norway, for example, they use their mining royalties and throw it back into public education and this, that, and the other, while we actually we are subsidising our mining industry more so than we subsidise higher education. So this is all sort of a little bit crazy. But when you get down to these arrangements that were made in the late days of the Howard government, absolutely outrageous. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why he keeps getting away with it. He'd bob up every now and then with a thought bubble of his own. Basically sold this country's future down the river, certainly in terms of gas supply. But you go on, Jack, because this is more contemporaneous, of course.
I just thought it was interesting that Chris Bowen made a speech the other day, and he said that first, gas will play an important role in electricity by firming and peaking renewables. Unlike coal and nuclear, gas generation is flexible. The ability to turn gas peaking power stations on and off at very short notice is sensible support for the renewables. This is an interesting kind of slight change in tack from the government. Madeleine King, who's the minister responsible for gas, etc., has been pushing this. But
she's the minister for minerals or mining, isn't she? Yeah.
But this is the first time that Bowen has actually spoken in this way. But it's a little bit of a display of common sense that has been needed.
Well, I think part of the problem was, I don't want to go over it again, but part of it was that we had to drag, and that was to sit down with the mining companies and drag some supply back at a reasonable price. Yeah. And that had to be done first.
And can I add this week as well, the Grattan Institute, which is a sort of a left-wing think tank, I think.
Yes,
attached to Melbourne,
that's
Melbourne
a fair
University.
description. Yep.
Fair description. They issued a report saying that the renewable energy target supports renewables, but not the other technologies that could displace coal while ensuring reliability at low cost. So they're saying the renewable energy target's okay, but we need to have something we need to have some kind of a target to find something else that will be the firming agent in a renewables future.
So, for our listeners, the government has implemented the gas market code, and the code offers gas producers a simple choice: comply with a price cap of $12 a gigajoule in wholesale contract negotiations. These are all new things, or seek an exemption by committing to additional supply in the short term and new investment in the medium term to support reasonable prices and on reasonable terms. So far, producers have committed a total of 564 petajoules. How many is that, Jack?
I don't know.
How much is a petajoule? Because it's more. I think it'll be 1,000 gigajoules, won't it? 564 petajoules. I know listeners will correct me on this. In supply and investment to support the East Coast gas market. That's a huge improvement from the gas supply crisis that the government inherited.
I'm not sure how big it is, but I'd be horrified if I saw one on my gas bill.
Yes, you've just burned a couple of petajoules. And this is true. I mean, it's that the government inherited, and this is obviously from Bowen's speech, but other governments have inherited this. I mean, from the Rudd government onwards have inherited this sort of nonsense. I mean, I just can't have this guy continually deified as our greatest prime minister when he sold this country's resources down the river and ensured that we would pay more for them than the export countries that they go to. Unbelievable stuff. Should never be allowed out in public again until he explains himself on that. Yeah, so you think it's a good move, Jack? The getting gas in, you're right. It's a far more flexible source than coal, for example, and you can sort of turn these things on and off rather quickly. You don't have the enormous amount of expense and capital as you would with a coal mine, some 100 or 200 kilometres away from an electricity generator.
Well, it's certainly a move in the right direction. And they've not made many of those with energy policy for a while, so there might be.
All right. Well, we've just got a little bit of an aside here. The op shop becomes big business, or maybe it's just one. in Melbourne's trendy High Street. That's not High Street Northcote, mate. That's I think it's High Street Armadale, isn't it, or Malvern?
No, it's High Street in Northcote, I think.
Is it really?
Yeah, High Street in Northcote is the coolest.
Oh, it is trendy. Don't get me wrong, but it ain't Armadale.
It was ranked as the coolest street in the world just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, we did talk about that. But look, there's a surging demand for second-hand goods. It's meant a huge expansion for the Salvation Army's retail arm, with OpShop even opening a store on Melbourne's trendy High Street. Well, it must be Northcote. Well, to be honest, the rents would probably kill them in Armadale and Malvern, Toorak. The 144-year-old charitable organisation unveiled ambitious plans this week to open more than 35 stores nationwide in 2024 in what National Director Matt Davis called an evolution in its strategy. Davis told the New Daily that about 300,000 Australians are now visiting Salvo's stores every week amid a huge rise in second-hand shopping. And that's around clothing, obviously. But can I just tell you, just because I've experienced this, we've had issues around trying to find a good home for some furniture, my late mother's, and what they call the brown furniture market, the second-hand brown furniture market, is just in free fall. You'd be mad to go to Harvey Norman and buy yourself a new couch. You'd be able to get something perfectly good for a whole lot less at some of these second-hand furniture stores. The bottom's just blowing out on that.
That puzzles me a little, I would say, in a country where there is concerns over rising migration, all that sort of stuff, more people coming into the country. You would think that there would be kind of a shortage of second-hand furniture, wouldn't you?
Well, part of the problem is that if you want to buy, I mean, they're not cheap. Let's say you just want to buy a big couch. You go to Harvey Norman, you get 5 years interest-free, and you lay down a couple of grand. And people go, well, it's yours, it's new, it's all that sort of stuff. But you'd be able to pick up something for about $200 or $300, have it cleaned, have it reupholstered for another couple of hundred, or maybe even $1,000, and you've got a perfectly good couch. But it just doesn't work that way. I mean, we tried to move some furniture, and in the end, we weren't looking for money. It was just like find a good home. But we were battling with that, and some of these things are antiques. So it is a bit sad.
The clothing trade part of the
that's a bit different, because I think there is a more a cultural thing around retro clothing and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, apparently they think it's worth over $1 billion a year Australia wide. Not just the Salvos, but all of the second-hand and op shops.
There'll be second-hand op shops that aren't linked to charities. Salvos, of course, are a charity. There's one down here.
Vinnie de Paul's, etc.
Yeah, there's a Vinnie's here in my part of the world that gets people going through it. And of course, people... a lot of people spend enormous amounts on clothing, and they need to get rid of their wardrobes after a while, so to create space so they can go buy more.
I was doing it a little bit of it myself yesterday. We'll go to a Filipina friend, and so some fat bastard in Manila will be wearing it next week. Yeah.
I thought you were going through the racks there, Jack. Pick up something nice in a basic black, but no, you're getting rid of a few suits.
Well, a few different things, yeah.
No waist,
and it's very easy.
Waistline no good anymore.
Yeah, well, it's I blame the dry cleaners; they shrink them.
So I know someone's been shrinking my clothes too. It's awful.
Doesn't seem to affect the length, but they do shrink them. Yeah.
Now we move on to media, and you've got something here about the church and state rule, and we know what church and state rule is, don't we, Jack? That's basically these things.
You're our media man, so you're going to tell us.
Well, this is not something that I guarantee you anyone has actually ever explained in these ways. The church and state rule, obviously, these things are kept separate, but here we've got an instance in the Channel 9 media where someone is, or media writer, her name is Zoe Samios, who's been working at Nine, Mastheads, SMH and the Age for some time. She'd written a straight news story about a content streaming war being waged between Stan and Foxtel. And the story was not favourable to Stan insofar as it reported that Foxtel had edged out Stan to clinch the rights to particular content. And while the story is factually correct, in comes Channel 9 boss Mike Sneesby to go, hey, you're not promoting Stan, which is one of their that's their streamer. So he basically rings up the journalist and says, released a bit of a tirade, Jack, to the poor journalist who was just reporting the facts. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure this doesn't happen at News Corp at all.
I don't know the truth of that, but I think if you're going to be a journalist, you're going to have to develop strong eardrums because you're going to get the odd sir.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one, and
just explain what the church and state for our listeners.
Well, the church is management, and the state is the journalism, the reporting.
Yeah.
And never the twain shall meet, but there are often pressures, of course, if you're a newspaper and you've got an advertising contract with a provider, let's say a major retailing company, and then you've got a piece alongside it that accuses that major retail company of obtaining timber from old growth forests and things like that. See, that would be a bit of a no-no. And the subs would have great difficulty placing that yarn. So there is the sort of the power of advertising, and then media companies have a number of streams to their business. It's used to be in the old days they'd either run newspapers or they'd do television. They couldn't do both. Now they can do all sorts of things, including having those streaming things. I mean, it might be.
Even back in those days, they were, the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald were getting their rivers of gold out of real estate and car ads and employment ads. So there was always a certain reluctance to run stories bagging the housing sector or all that sort of stuff because.
Look, and there's another string to that bow that's maybe not so much church and state, but a lot of the finance reporters I know coming out of Nine or have come out of Nine are saying that they basically become like posters of public relations for companies. And I looked at one. They did a fluff piece on this con artist who was selling jewellery around Paddington, Jack, at a shop front. And she, this is 20 years ago, and they were extolling her as an entrepreneur and all this sort of stuff. She ended up basically pulling a pretty long con on other people, and some years later. But the first actual notice of this person, she'd actually ever come from England. First notice was this fluff piece in the Sydney Morning Herald saying what a great achiever she was. She's just an outrageous con artist, by the way. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff. You don't want news as PR, but some of us are realistic enough to know that if it's not that you're not toting the editorial line, but the management, the church, may have struck a deal with a major advertiser, and advertising revenue for newspapers these days is like gold. You don't get much of it. You need a fair bit of it, and if that would mean that you're probably not going to be there's not going to be a lot of critiquing of that company in the short term, at least.
It's a constant battle, but one that will never go away. I think
I mean, look. Yeah, look, I've probably got more stories to tell on this than I probably should, but I've been involved in writing advertising copy and things like that for the newspaper for some time. I've done it, and I'm happy to say that I've done it. And it's part of that process. You can actually market to a company and say, we will get professional writers to do your copy for you.
Yes.
And it's part of a package, so I've done that. It's quite lucrative, actually. No shame in it at all. But yes, there are always the pressures between management and the paper. And
talking about it being lucrative, you were talking before about finance journalists who get bored with just reposting the other people's copy.
Yeah.
That's about the point where they normally leave journalism and go into PR because there's more money. There's more money in writing.
There are a lot of people. But look, one of the things. I mean, Michael West Westy's not a close mate of mine, but I've known him for a long, long time. And Westy just got jack of it at the Herald. He said, look, I just, we're not doing any journalism. We're just doing a bit of a rewrite of PRs coming from firms who want us to do, fluff pieces on them. And he had enough. So Michael West, I think it's michaelwest.com.au. Well worth a look on the site there. He runs a site that I think runs through a Patreon or runs on donations in some ways, and he's picked up another one journalist from the Australian. Good guy, decent guy. Maybe in some ways that is the future of investigative journalism, certainly in that financial sector, in that finance sector.
He's always worth a keeping on. Well, I don't read it all the time, but I keep an eye on it. I look at the headlines and read the bits I want.
No, he's a good operator, Westy. Anyway, and well worth a look, people. If you don't know it, he's pretty prominent on social media. But I think it's just michaelwest.com.au, and that opens it all up. Why does Anthony Albanese need 11 media advisors, Jack?
I had a look at this and I almost fell off my chair when I read the number. It's a cricket team. When I read the number, it's extraordinary. These people ought to be taken back to old Parliament House and see the size of the Prime Ministerial office there, and they fitted everybody in there. The ministerial offices have just grown like topsy. I just think it's out of hand, and I'm not sure it's any better. We're any better off for it. And at the moment, you've got to say, if Anthony Albanese has got 11 media advisors, well, 10 of them must be doing a pretty rubbish job because he's not going that well, media-wise.
Brett Mason is his Director of Communications, and he's a former SBS political journalist, good operator, good guy. There are a lot of people there. I mean, I think there's so many, this might answer your question there, Jack, that I don't know that he'd be getting clear advice. I mean, it depends on how Brett goes in terms of turning some of the advice down and some of the advice up according to his calls. But you can say, look, he's a Prime Minister, he can do whatever he wants, but in terms of appointments, but that's too many. You're just going to get a confusion. You're going to get a lot of noise of it, rather than advice.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem with that.
And at the moment, I think that might be the problem.
Well, let's spare a thought for Anthony Albanese, who gets his media briefings from 11 different people every day. Yeah. No wonder the man's confused. That should be about 4, I reckon. 1 boss and 3 runners.
Well, I can tell you, listeners, Old Parliament House is worth a walk around if you go to Canberra. And you see just how small ministerial levels of government was right up until it was the early 1980s.
I remember some of just the MP's offices, like phone booths, just flat out getting a table in there.
Yeah.
Not exactly built for it. But well worth a look, of course. The Australian Museum of Democracy, which is what it's called now, the old Parliament House, well worth a stroll around there, folks. If you're ever in Canberra, lots to do and see in Canberra, and that's one place you should go and have a look at. Reeks of history.
What it used to have as well was the non-members bar, which was the kind of centrepiece of the place, really.
And I think it was Keating who said that after 1975, I mean, there was always a sort of collegiate view about political opponents. Everyone was in the same boat, but after 1975, Keating says that all ended. And it became a sort of partisan thing. I mean, I'm sure they still sort of bump into one another around a place of political opponents, but there was a sort of mutual respect that probably went in around the dismissal in 1975.
Yeah, I got to say, I was in the non-members bar a couple of times after 1975, and you'd still see opposing members having a refreshment together.
Yeah. That was post 1975, would have been.
Yeah, post 1975.
Yeah. Anyway, we must move on to matters overseas. Excuse me.
This is really important about
this. Is really, really funny to me.
It's not just funny; it's important. This is the presidential campaign in the United States. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign, and his staffers are reportedly afraid of microwave ovens.
They're afraid of microwave ovens, and they're obviously not afraid that microwave ovens could topple and fall on them.
No.
They're afraid of standing too close to it. Microwaves, you can't see them, but they're there, and they could render. What's the fear? What are we talking about?
It's the electromagnetic radiation that they think could harm people. I used to have a client when I was he wanted to become a client back in my early lawyering days. I think some wag at the law firm managed to get him to me, but he used to come in monthly with this reams of documents to tell me that people living next to power lines were dropping dead, willy-nilly, and I could never find any evidence to back it up.
Yeah. Look, you could understand Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He's frightened of quite a lot of things, and vaccines, childhood vaccines are just one of them. But this is a disturbing development, and he's it's kind of proof that there's no conspiracy too small for Bobby Kennedy Jr. to have a good crack at it. I also love this little story here too, Jack, and I can tell you that I am the recipient of some of the benefits of this. This is the IV, the intravenous drip to get over your hangover, and I can tell you it works. Now, mine was a bit serendipitous, but I was full as a Catholic school, and about 5 hours later, after being on an IV drip, as good as gold. Could have driven home.
Yeah, well, it did Keith Richards the world of good for a long time.
It really does work.
What the story is about is that even respectable companies like the Four Seasons hotel chain are now offering recreational IV drips, so you can go to a wellness spa.
This is how far we've come.
And they'll whack a cannula in your arm and give you a drip of some kind to make you feel better.
As far as I know, all I had was saline, and you rehydrate.
Yeah, but do you remember the Brisbane Lions players, the midfielders? For a number of weeks back in their heyday, they were all playing with bandages on their arms because they had cannulas popping.
Yeah, I remember there were a lot of that. There was a furor around that.
Yeah, they had cannulas popped in their arm, and they'd go in at half time and get a saline drip for 10 minutes, and it would restore their energy. And the AFL said, "Well, no, you can't do that."
They did stop it, didn't they? And look, there's no real harm involved in this. You might have a little bruise on your on your wrist. That's about as far as it goes. And very briefly, Jack, we've had a lot of student protests around the country and around the world. Where's it all going to land politically?
It's hard to know, to be quite honest. The people involved seem to think it's going to be like 1968, but they don't understand the history of 1968 because 1968 led to the...
If history repeats, mate, Archer would win the Melbourne Cup again this year. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. But yes, I know what you mean. Everyone will strive to say, oh, well, this is just like 68 or 1988. I mean, everyone does it. I do it. But 68, there was a lot more going on in the States.
There was, but if you're a protester, don't take any comfort from 68 because Richard Nixon won the election in a landslide.
Yeah, there was 68. LBJ fell over, and then she had 72, and there's some shenanigans there, some Watergate shenanigans as well. So he probably, the old crook Nixon did trick it up. I mean, there was some appalling. That's what Watergate was all about, really, was undermining the Democrat campaign.
Yep.
But anyway, it's 72.
But he didn't need to do that in 1968 because the protesters were doing it for him.
The Democrats. Well, LBJ just didn't want to go on. And he probably would have won the election fairly comfortably, I would imagine. But then when he left, it exposed the vulnerabilities of the Democratic Party.
Yeah. My favourite little piece from it was that the Columbia Law School review people, these are the law students, the clever ones who get to write the learned articles for the Columbia Law Review. They want the exams to be cancelled, everyone to get good marks, because they are so shaken and traumatised by all that has gone on. And their spokesperson is in fact a PhD student. And can I just read her this for you? My dissertation is on fantasies of limitless energy in the transatlantic romantic imagination from 1760 to 1860. My goal is to write a prehistory of metabolic rift, Marx's term for the disruption of energy circuits caused by industrialization under capitalism. I am particularly interested in theories of the imagination and poetry as interpreted through a Marxian lens in order to update and propose an alternative to historicist ideological critiques of the romantic imagination.
Wow.
Can you? I understand all of those words. I just don't know what they mean when they're put together.
Imagine the 60,000 words of it, Jack.
Yeah, well,
unreadable.
You get through the first page and throw it in the bin, wouldn't you?
Oh dear. Look, we don't mind people protesting, but you got to understand there are consequences. I mean, this is, if you wor going to protest back in the Vietnam War days, or when Gough got railed, or a little bit later on, Jack's mentioned some of the nuclear disarmament rallies he's gone to. You got to expect a bit of biff. You got to expect wallopers aren't going to be too happy with you, and don't come crying to people if you're perfectly entitled to protest, but if you're basically holding a piece of land that is required, then there's going to be a stink, and go your hardest and see how you get on, but don't complain. Don't complain about it afterwards.
What's interesting to me about them is they nearly always appear masked, with a keffiyeh thrown across their face and all that sort of stuff, so to render them unidentifiable. The people who marched with Martin Luther King across the bridge at Selma, they proudly had their faces on display. They wanted people to know who they were. None of these people do. What that tells me, what that suggests to me, is that deep down, a lot of these people don't really believe what they're doing.
I think that you might be onto something there. I've spoken to some people who have taken a position in support of the Palestinians, and some of them are very thoughtful people, but they've got some fairly significant blind spots as well. All right. Look, Jack, we just have to ask. We're going to sort of wrap up our news around this. I mean, there are some fairly alarming things going on in Gaza. Certainly, there have been strikes into Rafah. It looks like, and there were warnings issued by the IDF to the people of Rafah, who had been less than 8 months ago told to move to Rafah for their own safety, and are now being, going to be beset with what appeared to be a boots on the ground type strike within the city. Obviously, there are over 1 million people there who are not properly accommodated, and it just seems like an absolute disaster in the unfolding. And I really don't think anyone, unless you're an absolute rusted-on supporter one way or another, any one of us wants to see another 30,000 Palestinians killed. There are some really a bit disturbing things. I mean, the Knesset actually supported this move, or the Israeli cabinet did it, was the one behind it, and they basically kicked Al Jazeera out of the country. There was a raid on their offices in Israel yesterday, and it's a sort of press freedom thing. I mean, you can be a critic of Al Jazeera and its reporting. It's based in the Gulf states, of course.
Based in Qatar.
Yeah, that's right. So there is, at least a geographical link between Hamas and that. But look, I watch Al Jazeera from time to time. I understand there's a particular emphasis there that you will get in most media, and there's peculiar emphasis there. But whenever I see a government shutting down a media organisation, I'm always very, very concerned.
Yeah, I don't like it either.
And I just think these Israelis need to let some of this sort of stuff go. As I say, Rafah, I don't think. Certainly, the world looks at what might happen there with a sense of exhaustion, a sense of real concern.
Well, from the Israelis' perspective, a majority of Israelis, but a pretty significant majority of Israelis, still see this as a 1945 moment. What they want is the destruction of Hamas, surrender.
Look, Hamas could make everything a lot easier. We got very, very close. Must have got very close to a ceasefire last week, and it just didn't.
And again
happen.
yesterday.
And it collapsed around the return of hostages.
Yeah.
Just really awful news. Awful news from that part of the world. AFL on the weekend. Sydney have really in early days are going better than anybody else at the moment, aren't they?
They were good. They were good this week. I think,
they're good against a good side too.
Yeah.
The Giants are a good side. And they beat them comprehensively. So they've done that a few times to good challenging sides. The Sydney Swans, they've still got a few back. In fact, how would you put? I think he's been a captain at various stages. Parker back into that side,
Yeah. Well, he was in the 24 or something named and didn't get a run. So.
Yeah, no, they're going beautifully. Geelong had their first loss to Melbourne, and Melbourne looked to be set for a good season. The Blues played the Pies in the blockbuster.
Last week we were talking about the different game styles and the consequence that has for the not so important to win the inside 50s. Melbourne actually were able to stop that against Geelong, because Geelong have been the masters of that.
Well, they're the masters that make you pay for
errors,
for turnover.
But Melbourne sat their defence. They kept their defensive shape much better, so that Geelong weren't able to rush the ball into a near empty forward line. So May and Weaver hung back. It's going to be interesting to see how those two tactical approaches play out as the year goes on, because they're quite different.
Yeah, look. One thing I noticed about Carlton, you said, the Carlton had 61 to 38 inside 50s against Collingwood, and they beaten by a goal. The Nick Dacos goal, and Collingwood fans would have loved it. He got away from a stoppage. and kicked around the corner goal and gave them the game with about, I think, 40 or 50 seconds to go. We can see the problem that the defensive failure that Carlton had. So Adam Chera was standing between, he was about five metres from the stoppage on the Collingwood goal side of it, and he got dragged into that contest, and that released Dacos to make that. So one of the things I found about watching Carlton is that they are getting beaten on the outside. It happened against Collingwood. It happened a fair bit against Geelong. Collingwood have the habit of bringing up two players into the contest every time. So you're going to be outnumbered in the contest. You can back yourself to beat one, but you probably won't beat two. And so, Carlton didn't adjust to that. And so when there was some contested ball, Collingwood won it, then they would have that outside runner available. So it might take two or three handballs to get to him, but bang, off they went. So Carlton need to adjust defensively. Jacob Wiedering has been just magnificent in the last couple of weeks. Hawkins goalless, and Myercheck barely had a touch. But the rest of that defence is battling a little bit. They pick up a couple this week. But, Jack, I was just going to tell you about important players and people that aren't probably recognised as really important players. Jacob Wiedering is probably Carlton's most important player, for example. But Adam Saad's been out for a few weeks, got a bad hamstring, and I think he's still 4 weeks away. I reckon he's one of the most important players Carlton has in just terms of where to be, where to run to, very creative with the footy, makes good decisions and executes well. And I just think he's one of those players that Carlton have been missing very badly for a little while.
Well, the backman who can intercept, run quickly and kick beautifully is an absolute weapon. They are, every side who's any good has got at least one. I mean, Nick Blakey's such an important player. For Sydney.
He does that, and he's a tall. He
can play on a tall or a short because he's quick. And these blokes are gold.
But his ability to deliver, by foot is just elite. So he's one that look, we saw him, I think, probably debut for the Swans 3 years ago, and just went, he's going to be terrific because his old man was a gun too, one of those sort of underrated players. Sydney looked great. I don't think Geelong will be too worried about their loss. Collingwood are coming. They're just out of the 8. Carlton just hanging on. What else have we got? The Bombers at 5th currently, Jack.
They're going okay.
They'll be very well pleased with their season so far.
So who's got what coming up? What have Carlton got?
Carlton play Melbourne on Thursday night. And you'd like to think they'd have a win. They've got a few coming back. McGovern's back, and I think, so down back, that'll help, Mitch McGovern being there. And I'm just trying to think. They've got another one coming back from a string, and I just can't think who it is. Lockie Fogarty, maybe, who's another one that perhaps people, certainly not a headline name, but just a really good contested footy guy, particularly down forward or in the midfield. Another one they missed a little bit of.
So they've got Melbourne.
They got Melbourne. I think they got Sydney not far away, and then they got Port Adelaide.
Sydney.
That's a mob I wanted to talk about. They look defensively. I was talking about Carlton's defensive weaknesses. Port Adelaide. Who'd they play on the weekend? They got belted. It might have been the Bombers, was it?
No, it was the showdown. It was the Crows.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, of course. And gee, they're defensively weak. The ball will come. The ball will come in, and you'll see defenders who just haven't even got their eyes on the footies. They're running backwards, all this sort of stuff. They look really, really poorly done there. So it's going to be interesting. But yeah, Carlton have got still a couple more tough ones. Melbourne and Sydney and Sydney.
And then,
So that won't be easy.
Then I think the Gold Coast and Port Adelaide and who else after that? The Gold Coast, Port, and Essendon. At the end of that 5, you'll have a pretty good idea of how Carlton's going to go.
Yeah, I think so. I think you need to sort of get to that. Hopefully they can be around about 7 and 4. I looked at the Geelong game, the Collingwood game, the Melbourne, and I thought, well, if they can win 3 out of that 5, they'll go okay. Well, they've already lost 2, and in fact, they've lost 3 of their last 4. So big challenges for them. I think that I don't think they need to do too much, but they need to get their defensive halves back and as quick as possible. But they also need some defensive technique that's just eluding them at the moment. And if you're going to put someone like Jacob Wiedering on a key forward, it's sometimes he loses his impact because he's just doing that defensive role. So that's another thing they probably should be looking at.
He's carted out of the game. Yeah.
Just very quickly, Jack, Premier League. Arsenal on top, Liverpool second, and Man City with a game in hand coming. The bookies have installed them as favourites to win the title there. Arsenal might just hang on, something to watch there. And Tottenham have lost 4 in a row, and they're going pretty badly at the moment.
Yeah, wheels have fallen off a bit there.
Wheels have fallen off a little bit. But look, if you're running Tottenham and at the start of the season, what would your objectives be? I mean, they're probably ahead of where they expected to be at the start of the season. So, and in the NRL, the Sharkies are doing nothing wrong. Storm doing nothing wrong whatsoever. We probably should devote a bit of time. We haven't got time on it, but we probably today. But we should devote a bit of time to talk about concussion issues. There's actually very touching letter written by Angus Brayshaw's brother saying I think he's had to retire out of footy at 26 or 27 due to concussion issues, and he wondered why Mr. Maynard didn't get rubbed out. And it's a fair question to ask. But we'll move on. We'll get on to that. The whole concussion issue, particularly around rugby league, is huge. And also, Jack, you've got the Kentucky Derby in your eyes.
I don't know whether you saw it.
No,
a cracking race. The winner got snuck. He was running behind the leader and snuck through a gap that wasn't there. He squeezed his way through to get the rails run. But meanwhile, down the outside, an American horse and a Japanese horse fought a ding-dong duel, and there was a lot of bumping. And towards the end, the American rider reached across and put his hand on the Japanese horse, and you couldn't really tell from the video from the head-on whether he grabbed the rein or pushed him away. And yet, and there was nothing in the finish. It was, an inch by an inch by an inch. And yet the race wasn't interfered with. No penalty, nothing. It would have been months in Hong Kong or in Australia.
So Sierra Leone came second.
Yeah,
but might have had this. This sounds like the 1954 Melbourne Cup, Jack. I think it was 54. Went rising fast, got rolled, and very badly checked. And the jockey actually got a month. The Tilapia or Telapia, I think his name was.
But there was no
month
objection
afterwards, but there was no protest.
And the same thing, the Japanese are very polite people, and they chose not to protest. So there you go. Meanwhile, just before we go, Super Rugby. Do you know whether it's over or not? I had a look. I think they're up to about week 12. There's 4 weeks to go, and there are how many teams are there?
It used to be 15. They've got more now.
There are 12 teams, but 8 of them play finals. They play the AFL, 1v8, 2v7.
It's not 12 teams. There's it used to be called the Super 15, but they've gone.
No, there's just 12. So 12 teams and 8 of them play finals. Right. And you sort of wonder what the whole season's about when only the bottom
it's
4.
It's a bit of a warm-up.
Yeah.
I need to see the table here. Where's the table? So you've got there's only 12 sides. I thought they had more sides than that. So what happened to the 15s? They got a Fijian side in there. They're eighth, so they should make the finals.
Yeah, they probably
Moana
will, but
Pacifica, and that must be sort of a Tongan
that's
group.
Samoa.
Yeah?
That's Samoa and Tonga. Yeah.
Okay.
So the Waratahs and the Force probably not going to make the finals, but and nor the Crusaders, but all the other Australian sides. But this is pointless. You play for 14 weeks and then 8 of you play finals.
Warm up, mate. Come on, couple of practice matches.
It's no wonder that no one goes to watch it.
Well, there you go. That's probably why the journalist was bagging Stan, because Stan delivers the rugby or the Super 12. Is it called Super 12? I think it's just called Super Rugby.
It's called Super Rugby Pacific, I think is his name these days.
It's not a product I'd be spending extra money on to watch. Hard enough watching all the AFL games. Now, what do you got to take us out, Jack?
This is lovely. It was an online discussion prompted by a TikTok, one of those dancing TikTok videos of graduating Harvard medical students, very self-congratulatory, very full of themselves. And someone immediately popped on the social media underneath it saying, how are they going to go when they meet their first Filipino charge nurse? A lot of Filipino nurses in the United States. And there was much hilarity about this, about just how tough the Filipino charge nurses can be, even when they're only 5'4". And this one caught my eye. A cardiothoracic surgeon once told me, do you know how to say fuck you in Tagalog? And the answer was no. And he says, it's thank you, doctor. But said in a certain way.
Very nice. I did not know that. So we've got a bit of stereotyping going on there. Excellent work. All right. Well, that takes us out for episode 72. Just a quick reminder, if you want to hit us up, drop some comments, criticisms, whatever you have, you can hit me up on X, formerly known as Twitter, on @JackTheInsider. My DMs are always open, and you can hit up Jack on his Substack and give it to us, Jack.
HongKongJack.substack.com.
Yeah, drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. And look, that takes us out for the end of the show, and we'll be back with you next week with episode 73. Cheers, people.